The Walrus and the Carpenter, Part 3, Stanza 4. Now, in the last stanza, the last three lines in the previous stanza tell us that the eldest oyster had refused. He had refused to accept the offer of Walrus by shaking his heavy head, isn't it? But in this stanza, what do we see? But four young oysters hurried up, all eager for a treat. So, what's happening? In this stanza, we see that the four young oysters hurried up. They hurried up, all eager, all excited to leave their home, and they joined the walrus and the carpenter for the treat, for the fun and the good time they have been promised. Now, actually, you all must have noticed by now that the walrus and the oysters have been personified. Actually, this personification was there in the last stanza also. So you should mention it in case you interpret the last stanza wherever in your notebook or in any worksheet. So the walrus and the oysters have been personified. Why? Because they've been given human-like qualities. Now at this point, I actually want to discuss something called anthropomorphism, which is actually quite similar to personification, but it's different from personification. It's called anthropomorphism. Now, because I don't want to interrupt the interpretation of the poem, so I'm going to discuss it towards the end of the poem. All right. Now, so the oysters are given human characteristics. They are described as having clean faces. If you read these lines, their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. So they're described as having clean faces, possessing brushed coats, and neat and clean shoes. And what are they doing? They're grooming themselves. They are grooming themselves. They are getting ready for the supposed pleasant walk and pleasant talk. And then immediately in the next lines, what do we see? And this was odd because they hadn't any feet. So this humanization, on one hand, he's talking about these oysters having coats, having shoes, neat and clean shoes. So human like qualities have been given. But in the last three lines, this humanization is challenged. This humanization is challenged by the introduction of the fact that these oysters don't have any feet, which is true. Oysters don't have feet. Now, what is he doing? What is the speaker doing? He's mixing the realistic and the fictional elements together. And this is actually adding to the silliness, of the poem. Yes, don't forget it's a nonsense verse, isn't it? Now the speaker constructs this scene, this entire scene, in such a way that it evokes a sense of humor. It evokes a sense of humor. Oops, sorry. Yeah. Humour. Yeah. And, of course, lightheartedness, frivolity, isn't it? The reader somehow cannot rationally reconcile the fact that they have neat and clean shoes, the oysters have neat and clean shoes, but no feet. Yes, it's a nonsense verse. So, four other oysters followed them, and yet another four. Now, what is happening is that after those four oysters, the first four oysters joined the walrus and the carpenter, now four other means four more oysters follow them, and then they are followed by yet another four. And this continues till a sizable number starts following the walrus and the carpenter. So we see how these sea creatures move from their usual usual place of habitation. Yes, to the land. Now, the psychology of mass movement. You can also say herd mentality. So, the psychology of mass movement or herd mentality can be seen here. They don't introspect, these oysters. They don't introspect, they do not meditate upon the possible dangers, nor do they try to seek any guidance from the elder oyster. They don't even try to find out the reason why the elder oyster refused to accept such an alluring offer. What do? They just start rushing forth, skipping through the foamy surf. See? And thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more. So, more and more and more oysters are joining now. As I told you, mass movement, herd mentality, that kind of a psychology is being discussed, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. So, they just start running, they start rushing forth, skipping through the foamy surf. Yes? And they scurry out of the ocean. They jostle, they push, they scurry. So the words hopping and scrambling, see it's here, hopping and scrambling. These words not just show their excitement, but also their gullibility. Yes, gullibility, and what else? Their naivety. Okay, yeah. So do we see any figure of speech here? And more and more and more is a repetition. All right, let's move on to the next stanza. Now read these lines carefully. What is happening is now, after the group of oysters continue to walk for a mile, the walrus and the carpenter decide to rest on a low rock, leaving the oysters line up before them. This is what this entire stanza means. Now, the words conveniently low here. What do they suggest? Conveniently low. Convenient for whom? Well, oysters were standing at the feet of the walrus and the carpenter. All right, so definitely the low height of the rock or the rock itself was of no use for the oysters. It was the walrus and the carpenter who found the rock low enough for their use, for their convenience. And what do they intend to do? So, we'll find out in the next stanza. And all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. Now, the oysters are waiting in a row. So dutifully they are waiting. What does this show? This shows their expectations. Yes, they are standing, they are waiting. They've come all the way to this point, left their homes, dressed in coats, and combed their hair. And now they are looking at the walrus and the carpenter. They are looking at them, they are waiting for them. And let's see now what happens. Yes. Now read these lines carefully. The walrus now basically addresses. He addresses the oysters, telling them that the moment has arrived to discuss a variety of matters. And he gives a very random and a nonsensical list of things. I mean, he talks of shoes, ships, sealing wax, cabbages and kings in one breath, the reason why sea is boiling hot, and if pigs have wings. So, all these things, they have no relation with each other. He's not giving any real information here. Rather, he's talking like a con man. He's talking like a con man. Who is a con man? Well, a con man is someone who cheats people. All right. So he's confusing the oysters now. He promised a pleasant talk in the sixth stanza, if you remember. And now all he's talking is gibberish, nonsense, something that just doesn't make any sense. All right. Yes. Read these lines carefully. Now, what is happening is the oysters now interrupt his speech, the gibberish that he was uttering in the last stanza we read, isn't it? So they say, "But wait a bit," the oysters cried. So they interrupt his speech. They ask him to wait as they are fat. What is it? And all of us are fat. So the oysters are calling themselves fat. They're saying we are fat, and for some of us are out of breath, which means that even the walk till here has not been so pleasant. They're out of breath. They are gasping. They were struggling all this while to keep pace with the walrus and the carpenter. So, before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath and all of us are fat. No hurry, said the carpenter. Now, the carpenter is happy to comply. Yes, the carpenter says this, this particular line, where is it? Yeah, no hurry, these two words. Now, the walrus, I'm sorry, he apparently says these words, no hurry, to the oysters, but this could also mean that he himself is in no hurry, as he knows that the oysters are tired and they cannot run away anywhere now. So he assures them. He assures the oysters that they are in no rush, and the oysters are grateful. They thanked him for that. So the oysters are grateful. The oysters at this point of time cannot see the trickery or the deception involved here. All right, let's move on to the next stanza. Now the walrus starts listing. The walrus starts listing the items they require for a meal. For a meal, including bread, pepper, vinegar, all the things that go very well with the oysters. He asks the oysters if they are ready, as they now plan to feed themselves. See, now if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed. So what are they saying to them? They're saying that now we want to eat, we'll just start feeding ourselves. So I hope you guys are ready. Now at this point, when they say now if you're ready, we can begin to feed. At this point, the oysters realize. The oysters realize that the walrus and the carpenter intend to eat them. Truth finally dawns upon them. All right. Now, as soon as the oysters realize that they have been tricked and they realize the true intentions of the walrus and the carpenter, they turn blue. What does this mean? This means that they are shocked. They turn blue by shock and fear. All right. After such kindness, that would be a dismal thing to do. Now, what kindness are they talking about? They means the oysters. The oysters are referring to the kindness which the walrus and the carpenter showed them by allowing the oysters to rest after a tiring walk in the 12th stanza, if you remember. For oysters, this was an act of kindness. They are so innocent. They are so innocent and they are naive, and now they are going to pay for their naivety. They say, after being so kind to us, you'll eat us. They are trying to persuade them to change their mind. So what do they say? That, you've been so kind to us and now you're going to eat us. It'll be such a bad and disgraceful thing to do. What a dismal thing to do. They are still underestimating their predators by arguing, by trying to convince them that it would be such a dismal thing, such an impolite thing to do. After having shown so much of kindness, please don't do, don't do this. This is such a dismal thing to do. They probably still have hope that they can persuade them to change their mind. And what answer do they get? The night is fine, the walrus said. Do you admire the view? So the walrus responds by speaking of the night and asking them if they like the view. He's just not paying attention to what they're saying. All right, he is into his own world now. He's getting ready. What he basically had a task to accomplish, something that he had in mind from the very beginning, and now he's getting ready to complete that task, to accomplish that task. What is it? We already know by now. So, at this point, the readers actually feel pain and sympathy for these oysters. Why? They have actually walked to their death. The callous, the callous reply of the walrus now brings out his real character. It was so kind of you to come, and you're very nice. So what is he doing? What is he trying to portray? What is he trying to pretend? He's trying to be all decorous and courteous. All right. So with the gracious politeness of a host, the walrus continues. He thanks the oysters for coming and compliments them. And you're very nice. He's complimenting them. Now the carpenter said nothing, but cut us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice, which means that the carpenter actually says these three lines. He asks the walrus to provide another slice of bread and berates him, rebukes him, reproaches him for not accomplish such a simple task when the carpenter had asked him to do for the first time. So the carpenter, he's wholly solely concentrating or focusing on the food. He just wants the job to be done, and he doesn't want to indulge in any drama or any curtsies. Okay, so now the walrus tries to present a good image of himself by acting remorseful. Yeah. What does he say? It seems a shame, the walrus said. It seems a shame, the walrus said, to play them such a trick. Now he expresses regret. He expresses regret at having misled the oysters and putting them to this trouble of having exerted themselves. What does he say? After we've brought them so far and made them trot so quick. Okay? Trot. Trot means run, jog, scurry. So, scurry, yeah. So he says, it's a shame that we brought them so far and made them trot so quick. And now, basically, you people must have realized that this is sheer hypocrisy. This entire, his words, his regret, his remorse is nothing but hypocrisy. And what about the carpenter? The carpenter is not interested in drama or speech. He is only concerned about the butter being spread too thick on the bread. He just wants to gratify. He just wants to gratify his appetite. All right. Okay. I weep for you, the walrus said. I deeply sympathize. Now the walrus insists that he feels deeply for the unfortunate oysters. He feels pity. He feels sorrow. He's weeping. Yeah. And with sobs and tears, he sorted out those of the largest size. So he sobs and he weeps and he cries, while at the same time selecting the juiciest, the largest oysters, right? Holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. In fact, he cries so much that he holds a handkerchief to his face. Now, at this point, we feel that, all the limits of hypocrisy have been crossed. He has tricked them. He has tricked the oysters. He has deceived the oysters. And now he's going to eat them. And he still wishes to hide behind his tears and conceal his hypocrisy by showing sympathy and pain, isn't it? "Oh, oysters," said the carpenter, "you've had a pleasant run." So now that his belly is full and the task he wished to accomplish has been done, The carpenter now mocks. He mocks the oysters and their unfortunate demise. Okay, he addresses the oysters and comments on the fine exercise they had from their walk and asks if they would like to go home now. You've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again? Now, this line, shall we be trotting home again, is a rhetorical question. It's a figure of speech. Now, what is a rhetorical question? We've discussed this in one of my earlier poems. See, a rhetorical question we all know is asked not to get an answer, but to make a point. So, what point the speaker wishes to make here? Shall we be trotting home again? But the answer came there none. So, this is what he wants to emphasize upon, the poet, the speaker. By asking this rhetorical question, he wants to highlight the fact that these oysters have been deceived, they've been tricked, and they've been eaten. But the answer came none. Why? At this point, now the poet intervenes. He says that the oysters made no reply because they all had been eaten. The words scarcely odd. The words scarcely odd mean that it was hardly strange or unusual. All right, it was hardly strange or unusual. What was hardly strange? The fact that no voice came, no answer came, because they all had been eaten. So we are done with the poem now. Let's just quickly discuss the themes of the poem. So one of the major themes of the poem is deception. Deception, death, and wisdom. How? See, the walrus and the carpenter intend to eat the oysters. That was their intention from the very beginning. That is why they asked them to join them for a walk. But being wise, the older oyster understands their intention and does not join them. However, the young oysters fall into their trap despite the warning of their fellow oyster. So, on a deeper level, the poem gives a profound message urging people not to follow their leaders blindly. Okay, we can also say that the real message of the poem is for innocents like oysters to be careful and not fall prey to the trickery of the evil symbolized by the carpenter and the walrus. Another very important theme of this poem is hypocrisy. Hypocrisy and sentimentality. How? Let me just explain. See, the walrus and the carpenter showed exaggerated emotions. Yes, they showed exaggerated emotions while acting ruthless and cunning all the time, isn't it? They beseech the oysters, they weep, they sob, they offer pleasantries, and eventually what do? They eat up the oysters without showing any morals. So the poem clearly illustrates how sentimentality can be faked to disguise cruel motives. Yes? And lastly, the poem also makes some strong points about hierarchy and power. So, despite its silliness, we must say, yes, the poem does highlight something about hierarchy and power too. The sun invades the moon's territory with no regard to her feelings. He has the power, he does whatever he wants. Similarly, the walrus and the carpenter are authoritative figures. They have power over oysters, so they deceive and eat them. So it suggests that the powerful can gobble up the weaker ones whenever they want. All right. So this was all about the walrus and the carpenter. Hope you enjoyed the interpretation. Thank you so much. We'll meet in our next video. Thank you.